When a 7-year-old child is sold by her own grandmother, she not only loses her childhood, but her soul. For 10 years, I lived in hell while the adults who should have protected me counted the money from my pain. Good morning, my dear friends. This is Grandma Zelda here, with my 72 years of life experience, speaking directly from my modest home in rural Kentucky, where the mountain breeze brings some relief from the heat and from heavy memories. Anyone who sees me today, with my white hair, my garden plants in the backyard, and my prayer book always at hand, would never imagine what I lived through as a child. Before I begin this difficult story, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for watching. If this story touches your heart, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments which part of America you're listening from. That gives me strength to continue sharing these stories that need to be told. I was born in 1953 in a small town in Kentucky, so tiny it barely showed up on maps. Just a few dirt roads, a small church, a school that only went up to 4th grade, and lots of poverty. My mother worked in the fields from sunrise to sunset. And my father, well, he disappeared before I was even born, like so many other men of that era. We lived in a simple shack on the outskirts of town. Me, my mother, and my grandmother Josephine, or Grandma Jo, as everyone called her. She was a strong woman with dark skin wrinkled by the sun, calloused hands, and a gaze that seemed made of stone. I never saw her smile, not once in all the years we lived together. Our house was made of wooden planks, dirt floor, a roof that leaked when it rained hard. The three of us slept in a single room, separated from the kitchen only by an old curtain. There was no bathroom inside, just an outhouse in the backyard, one of those with a hole in the ground that we called a pit. At night, we used a chamber pot under the bed so we wouldn't have to go outside in the dark. Hunger was our constant companion. Some days, our only meal was a thin porridge made with cornmeal and a little water with salt. When my mother managed to bring some vegetables from the farm where she worked, it was a feast. Meat? Only on very special occasions, maybe once a month, and even then it was more bone than meat. Even with all this poverty, I had my childhood joys. I played with dolls made from corn husks, ran barefoot through the yard, climbed trees to pick fruit. At school, despite the difficulties, I stood out. Teacher Miss Lorna always said I was smart, that I could be somebody if I studied. It was shortly after I turned 7 that everything changed. I remember it like it was yesterday. It was a Sunday morning. My mother had gone to work at a rich family's house in town, even on Sunday because she needed the extra money. I was in the yard playing with pebbles when my grandmother called me. "Zelda, come here. There's work today." I thought it strange because Sunday was a day of rest, even for poor folks, but I obeyed, as I always did. Grandma Jo had a heavy hand and didn't tolerate disobedience. She took me inside, gave me a thorough bath, something rare in that house where water was scarce and precious. She combed my hair carefully, made 2 neat braids. Then she took out a dress that I only wore to church on Christmas. A little white dress with lace details that my mother had bought at a fair. "Grandma, why am I getting dressed up like this? Is it a special day?" I asked, confused. "Don't ask questions, girl. Just get yourself ready. Today we're going to the house of an important man who's going to help the family." I felt a chill in my stomach that I couldn't explain at the time. Today I know it was instinct trying to warn me of danger. But children don't understand these things. Children trust adults, especially those who should protect them. We walked for almost an hour, leaving the little town heading toward a farm that was some distance away. It was a big house, made of brick, with a porch in front and a car parked outside. Something rare in those times and in that place. They must have been rich indeed. A man was waiting for us on the porch. He seemed old to my child's eyes. He must have been about 50. Pot-bellied, sweaty, with a thick mustache and hairy hands. He looked at me in a way that made me want to hide behind my grandmother. "Is this her?" he asked, examining me from head to toe. "Yes, Mr. Anderson. Clean, healthy, just like we agreed. 7 years old, had her birthday last month." They talked a bit more, in low voices. I saw when he handed my grandmother some money, which she quickly tucked into her bra. "I'll bring her back before nightfall," the man said. That's when I panicked. My grandmother was leaving me there? With that strange man? I grabbed her skirt, begging her not to leave me. Grandma, don't go. I want to go with you. Please. She bent down, held my shoulders firmly, and spoke in a tone that didn't allow for discussion. Listen here, Zelda. You're going to stay and help Mr. Anderson with whatever work he needs. It's woman's work, understand? Every girl has to learn. If you're not good, we don't eat this week. Do you understand? I nodded, swallowing my tears. She had never spoken to me like that before, with that cold look, as if I were merchandise, not her granddaughter. And don't tell your mother anything when you get back. This is our secret. If you tell, I'll know, and you'll get beaten until you can't sit down. Are you listening to me? Again, I just agreed, paralyzed by fear. She turned and left without looking back even once. She left me there, alone with that man who smiled in a way that gave me chills. Come, girl, let's go inside. I have a job for you in there. What happened in that house in the following hours is something I spent decades trying to forget. Even today at 72, the memories are so vivid that sometimes I wake up screaming in the middle of the night. He took me to a dark room with closed curtains and a strong smell of sweat and cigarettes. He said he was going to teach me a woman's job that would help my family. That I would be a good girl if I did everything right. What he did to me in that room is not something I can describe in detail. Even after so many years, the pain, the terror, the confusion. A 7-year-old child has no way to process this kind of violence. I remember crying, begging him to stop, calling for my mother, for my grandmother. When it was over, I was bleeding, trembling, in shock. He took me to the bathroom, cleaned me with a rough towel, dressed me again in the little white dress that now had stains that never came out. If you tell anyone, I'll go to your house and kill your mother and grandmother. Understand, girl? I nodded, unable to speak. I was numb, as if my soul had left my body to avoid feeling that pain. When my grandmother came back to get me, it was almost night. I was still shaking, could barely walk right. She looked at me, at the stained dress, and showed no emotion. He said you behaved well. That's how it needs to be. On the way back home, she told me that this was normal, that all girls went through it, that it was a job that only women could do, that the money she received would buy food for the whole week. Don't make that face, girl. It wasn't so bad. Next time will be easier. Next time. Those words caused me such terror that I vomited right there on the side of the road. My grandmother gave me a few taps on the back, impatient. Stop with this fussiness. Do you want to starve? Do you want to see your mother sick from working so hard? This is all you need to do to help the family. Other girls your age do much worse things. When we got home, my mother was already there, worried about our absence. My grandmother explained that we had gone to visit a friend of hers who was sick, that I had played with other children and gotten dirty in the yard. I wanted to scream, tell everything, beg my mother to protect me. But the words wouldn't come out. The fear of what might happen, the threats, and more than that, the shame, a deep shame, as if what had happened was my fault. That night, lying on the thin mattress I shared with my mother, I cried silently until I fell asleep. She must have noticed something strange, because she hugged me tighter than usual, as if she sensed something was wrong. But she didn't ask anything. Maybe from exhaustion, maybe from fear of the answer. What I didn't know that night, and would take years to discover, was that this first visit would be just the beginning of hell. My grandmother had found a source of income, and I was the commodity. The following week, we went to another house, then another, and another. Different men, different places, but always the same story. My grandmother would get me ready, take me, receive the money, and leave me with them for a few hours. She used different excuses for my mother, that we were going to help at someone's house, or visit an acquaintance, or pick up donated clothes. Always on days when my mother worked away from home, so she wouldn't suspect. Over time, the pattern changed a bit. Sometimes my grandmother didn't leave. She stayed in the living room of the house, chatting with the men, drinking coffee or whiskey, telling stories, while I was taken to the bedroom by them. She pretended not to hear my crying, my pleas. She counted the money while waiting for the job to finish. The threats were constant. If I refused to go, she said I wouldn't eat that week. If I told anyone, she swore she would send me to a much worse place, where disobedient girls go and never come back. That's how life is, she always repeated. Women were born to suffer. The sooner you learn that, the better. Once, I tried to resist. I hid under the bed when she called me for the job. She dragged me out by my hair, gave me a beating with her apron belt, and locked me in the back shed, where we kept firewood and tools. I stayed there for 2 days, without food, just a little water that she would pour into a plate from time to time, as if I were a dog. When she finally took me out, I was so weak and so scared that I didn't resist anymore when she got me ready for another visit. The money she received never seemed to be enough. Our house remained poor, food remained scarce. Later I discovered that a good part went to the whiskey she drank in secret, and to gambling with other women in the neighborhood. I tried to tell my mother once when I was almost 8. I waited for a moment when we were alone. My grandmother had gone out to buy something at the store. "Mom," I began, my voice trembling. "Grandma Joe takes me to men's houses." I couldn't finish. The slap came hard, leaving the mark of 5 fingers on my face. "What lie are you making up about your grandmother? She takes care of you while I kill myself working. What a shame, Zelda. What ingratitude." I never tried to tell again. I understood that I was alone in that nightmare. The years went by, and the horror continued. From 7 to 9, from 9 to 10. Each year brought new men, new houses, new abuses. My grandmother transported me in different ways to avoid raising suspicions. Sometimes on foot through hidden trails, sometimes hitchhiking in wagons, sometimes in cars when the client was rich enough to pick us up. I remember once, I must have been about 9, when I was taken in the trunk of a car. It was dark, hot, I could barely breathe. When we arrived and the trunk opened, I saw that we were at a big house in a neighboring town. There were other men waiting. That night, there were 3, one after the other. My grandmother stayed on the porch, drinking whiskey with 2 more, waiting her turn to receive payment. I arrived home in the early hours, hurt, bleeding, with a high fever. My mother was desperate, had called neighbors to look for us. My grandmother made up that we had gone to visit a sick relative in another town, that the bus broke down on the way back, that we had to wait on the road. "And why is she like this? Looks like she's been beaten," my mother shouted, examining me in the light of the kerosene lamp. "She fell from the bank near the bus stop. You know how clumsy she is," my grandmother answered, with that stone face that never showed emotion. I was sick for days, with fever, body aches, an infection that made me cry every time I went to the bathroom. My mother made teas, applied compresses, prayed a lot. My grandmother just watched, irritated by the delay my illness was causing in the jobs. As soon as I got a little better, she was already preparing me for the next visit. It was as if nothing had happened, as if almost dying was just a temporary inconvenience. "Hurry up, girl. We lost almost 2 weeks with this whining of yours. Money doesn't fall from the sky." By this point, I was almost 10 years old. I was no longer an innocent little child. I was starting to understand what was happening to me, even without having words to describe it. I knew that what my grandmother called woman's work was wrong, that other girls my age didn't go through this. I saw how the other girls at school played carefree, how they had a sparkle in their eyes, how they still believed in good things, while I was already dead inside. Only my body continued to function, like a broken doll that someone forces to move. At school, my teachers noticed that something was wrong. I, who had been a brilliant student, now could barely concentrate. I had nightmares in the classroom, got scared when someone touched me, even if it was just a pat on the shoulder. My notebook had dark, frightening drawings that made the teacher look at me with concern. "Zelda, is something happening at home?" Miss Lorna asked once, calling me after class. I opened my mouth to speak, to finally ask someone for help. But at that exact moment, I saw my grandmother standing at the classroom door, watching me with those stone eyes. She had come to pick me up from school, something she never normally did. "Nothing, teacher," I murmured, lowering my eyes. "I'm just tired." Miss Lorna looked from me to my grandmother, and something in her look told me she suspected. But what could she do? In that time, in that place, questioning a grandmother about how she raised her granddaughter was unthinkable. The switch and the belt on the behind were considered normal methods of education. Besides, my grandmother was respected in the community, or at least feared. Everyone knew her difficult temperament, her sharp tongue, her ability to hold grudges for decades. Nobody wanted to mess with Josephine. It was around this time that I began to plan my escape. I didn't know where I would go, how I would survive, but anything seemed better than continuing in that life. I started to save small things: a piece of bread hidden away, some coins I found on the street, a map of the region that I tore out of a school book. My dear friends, it pains me to relive these memories. Sometimes I need to stop, take a deep breath, and remember that that frightened little girl managed to survive, that I am here today, so many years later, able to tell this story to you. If you're still with me up to this point, thank you very much. I know it's not easy to hear these things, but it's important that these stories are told, that these dark secrets come to light. Because somewhere, at this very moment, there is a child going through something similar, thinking they are alone, that nobody will believe them. The worst was yet to come in my story. At 10 years old, when I thought I had already lived through the worst that life could offer, I discovered that hell has many levels, and I was just beginning the descent. Life has a cruel way of making us accept the unacceptable. When terror repeats day after day, week after week, it loses that initial impact. Not because it hurts less, it never hurt less, but because your body and mind create mechanisms to continue functioning despite the pain. It's as if a part of you disconnects, leaves the body, and observes from afar what is happening. That's what happened to me between 10 and 12 years old. What used to cause panic was now routine. Terrible, painful, but routine. I knew exactly what to expect when my grandmother called me with that specific tone of voice. "Zelda, fix your hair, because today there's work." The visits had a pattern. 2, sometimes 3 times a week. Almost always in the afternoon, when my mother was at work. Different men, but with the same look. Some pretended to be gentle at first, offered candies, spoke in a mild voice. Others didn't even bother to pretend. All ended the same way, taking by force what no child should give. The worst of all was seeing how my grandmother Josephine had turned it into an organized business. Over time, she developed a network of regular clients and even a price list. The younger the girl, the more expensive. The more special services, the higher the value. She negotiated at the door like someone selling vegetables at the market, without a hint of emotion on her face. "She's clean, healthy. This here is the price. If you want more time, it's this much more. If you want to do different things, we can arrange it." I stood there, head down, while she discussed the details as if I were merchandise, an object without feelings or will of my own. In some houses, she would leave me and go away, coming back hours later to pick me up. In others, especially when there were several men, she stayed in the living room or kitchen, drinking coffee, drinking whiskey, talking about life as if nothing was happening in the rooms next door. Once, when I was about 11 years old, I was taken to a remote farm, one of those with a big mansion and several employees. It was the owner's birthday, a middle-aged fat man that I already knew from previous visits. There was a party going on, with loud music and lots of drinking. My grandmother got me ready with a dress that she had sewn herself, light pink, with bows, making me look even younger than I was. "Today is a special day," she said, while braiding my hair. "Colonel Zachary is turning 50. He paid well, so you're going to be nice, you hear? Do everything he and his friends ask." We arrived in the late afternoon. The party was already lively, with drunk men dancing in the yard to the sound of a banjo player. My grandmother took me straight to the back of the house, where the so-called colonel was waiting with 3 more men. They were all already drunk, with red eyes and stumbling walks. "The birthday present has arrived, Zach," shouted one of them, looking me up and down. The colonel smiled, passed his hand over my head like someone petting a dog, and handed a wad of money to my grandmother. It was more than usual. I could tell by the way her eyes gleamed as she counted the notes. "Make yourselves at home," she said, tucking the money into her bra. "Just don't hurt the girl too much. I have another appointment with her tomorrow." She left, closing the door behind her, leaving me alone with 4 adult men. What happened in that room during the following hours is something I try to erase from my memory to this day. It was all of them, one after the other. When one finished, he would go out to drink more and come back to enjoy again. I lost count of how many times each one used my body that night. At some point, I fainted from pain and exhaustion. When I woke up, I was thrown on a dirty mattress in the back of the house, bleeding and with bruises all over my body. I couldn't even get up properly. My grandmother appeared at the door, irritated by the delay. "Hurry up, girl. It's almost dawn. Your mother will be coming home from the night shift and can't find you out of the house." She didn't even help me get up. She stood at the door, rushing, while I tried to gather strength to stand. When she saw that I could barely walk, she let out a sigh of impatience and pulled me by the arm. "Always this fussiness. Stop making a fuss. I've already told you that this is normal. Every woman goes through this." On the way back, walking with difficulty on the dirt road, I asked her for the first time something that had tormented me for years. "Grandma, why do you do this to me? Don't you like me?" She stopped, looked at me with those cold eyes, and answered something I never forgot. "Liking doesn't fill the belly, girl. When I was your age, my mother did the same to me. That's how it is. Poor women only have their bodies to sell in this world. The sooner you learn that, the less you suffer later." It was the only time she mentioned something about her own past. She never touched on the subject again. But that phrase kept hammering in my head for years. Was it really like that? An endless cycle of grandmothers selling granddaughters, who grew up to become grandmothers, who sold granddaughters. When we got home, my mother was already there, worried about our absence. My grandmother told the same story as always, that we had gone to help at an acquaintance's house, that the work took longer than expected. "And why is she limping? And this bruise on her arm?" my mother asked, examining me with eyes tired from the night shift at the hospital where she worked as a cleaner. "She fell down the stairs when she was cleaning the windows," my grandmother answered without hesitation. "This girl is very clumsy." My mother believed it, or pretended to believe it. Sometimes I wonder if she really didn't suspect anything, or if deep down she knew but chose not to see. Maybe it was easier that way. Maybe the weight of knowing the truth was too much for her, who already carried so many burdens. After that night at the farm, I was sick for almost 2 weeks. High fever, intense pain, a strange discharge that caused me burning. My mother wanted to take me to the doctor in the neighboring town, but my grandmother wouldn't let her. "It's just a little flu. Give her garlic tea with lemon, and it will pass." She knew that a doctor would recognize the signs of abuse, would ask difficult questions to answer. So I stayed at home, receiving the limited care that my mother could offer between one work shift and another. As soon as the fever went down, even though I was still in pain, my grandmother was already preparing me for new visits. The money from the farm had run out, spent on whiskey and the card game she frequented in secret, and we needed more. "Get ready, because today we're going to Mr. Yuve's house." For the first time, I openly rebelled. I threw the dress she offered me on the floor and shouted, "I won't go. I can't take it anymore. I'm tired of being hurt." The slap came hard, knocking me down on the bed. She had never hit me in front of my mother. But that day, we were alone in the house. "Listen here, you ungrateful girl. Do you think food appears on the table by miracle? Do you think this roof over your head is free? If it wasn't for me negotiating these jobs for you, we would have already died of hunger." I shrank on the bed, protecting my face with my arms, expecting more blows. But instead, she changed tactics. Her voice became lower, more threatening. "If you don't go today, you don't eat anything else in this house. I'll lock the food cabinet and keep the key. Let's see how long you last with just water." It wasn't an empty threat. She had done this before, for shorter periods, when I showed resistance. One day without food, sometimes 2. This time, from her tone of voice, it would be different. "And if you keep disobeying, I'll send you away. I know people who take girls to work in other cities. There, yes, you'll see what it's really like to suffer." Hunger was a real fear for me. We had already gone through difficult periods, with only one thin meal a day. The idea of being sent far away to an unknown place, with people even worse than my grandmother, terrified me. So I went, and I kept going in the following weeks. Resistance had too high a price. Around this time, I started having serious problems at school. I couldn't concentrate. I would fall asleep during classes after nights of not being able to close my eyes. I had nightmares in the classroom that made me scream suddenly, frightening classmates and teachers. My teacher, Miss Lorna, tried to talk to me, to understand what was happening. Once, she called me after class. "Zelda, you were my best student, and now you can barely write your own name. What's happening, my child? Is there something at home you want to tell me?" I looked at her, at those kind eyes full of sincere concern, and almost told her everything. The words were on the tip of my tongue, but then I remembered my grandmother's threats. What would happen if I spoke? And more than that, I remembered the times I had tried to tell my own mother and wasn't believed. Why would a teacher believe me? "It's just tiredness, teacher. I've been helping a lot at home." She didn't seem convinced, but she didn't insist either. In those days, family problems were considered a private matter in which no outsider should interfere. I stopped going to school shortly after. My grandmother decided that I already had enough education and that my time would be better spent working. In reality, she feared that I might end up telling something to the teachers, or that they would notice the increasingly evident signs of abuse. My mother protested weakly. She valued education, dreamed of seeing me graduated someday. But the final word was always my grandmother's, who controlled the money and the decisions of the house with an iron hand. A 12-year-old girl needs to learn to take care of the house, not waste time with books. I never learned to read, and I'm here, alive and strong. Thus, my world became even smaller. Without school, without friends, without any contact with the outside world beyond the terrible visits that my grandmother arranged. I began to live in a universe composed only of our shack and the houses of the men who bought me. It was during this period that I developed a method to mentally survive the abuses. When they started, I would close my eyes and transport myself to another place. I imagined a green field with colorful flowers and a stream of clean water. In this place, I could run, play, be just a child. Nobody hurt me there. Nobody touched me in ways that caused me pain and shame. It was a dissociation, although I didn't know that word at the time. My mind literally disconnected from my body in order not to feel the horror it was going through. While adult men raped a 12-year-old girl, this girl visited imaginary fields where she could be free. The frequency of the visits increased over time. Without school to justify my absence at certain times, my grandmother could take me at any time of day, 3, 4 times a week, sometimes more than once on the same day, with different men. My body began to show the signs of this constant abuse. Recurrent infections, bleeding, chronic pain that never completely disappeared. I developed a persistent cough that I later discovered was tuberculosis, probably contracted from one of the clients who was already visibly sick when my grandmother sold me to him. The tuberculosis was, ironically, a brief period of relief. I got so sick that not even my grandmother risked taking me for visits. For almost a month I could stay at home, coughing up blood, with high fever, but at least free from the daily abuses. A neighbor who had experience as a healer was the one who diagnosed my disease. She prepared herbal teas, said prayers, applied poultices on my chest. Slowly, I began to get better. As soon as the fever subsided and the cough decreased, my grandmother was already planning to put me back to work. But the healing neighbor, Miss Nancy, interceded. "The girl is still weak, Josephine. If you force her now, she might have a worse relapse. Tuberculosis is no joke." It was the first time I saw someone directly confront my grandmother. Miss Nancy wasn't afraid of her, perhaps because she was older, perhaps because she had respect in the community as a healer. The fact is that my grandmother hesitated, retreated, temporarily. All right, she can rest for another week, but then she goes back to normal work. That extra week was precious. I regained some strength, not just physical, but mental. And most importantly, I received daily visits from Miss Nancy, who came to check my condition and bring more of her homemade remedies. It was during one of these visits, when we were alone, my grandmother had gone out and my mother was at work, that she asked me the question that would change everything. "Girl, what has your grandmother been doing with you?" This body is too marked up to be just falls and accidents. Her look was different from any other I had seen. There was no judgment, no suspicion, just a deep compassion that broke through all my defenses. For the first time in years, I told the truth. I told everything, from the first visit at 7 years old to the multiple and frequent abuses I suffered now, at 12. I cried so much that I could barely speak at times. Miss Nancy just held my hands, listening in silence, occasionally wiping away her own tears. When I finished, I expected to see disbelief in her eyes, as I had seen in my mother's, but what I saw was anger. Not directed at me, but at the situation, at my grandmother, at the men who had abused a child. "My child," she finally said, "what they did to you is a crime, of the worst kind. Your grandmother has no right to sell your body like this. Nobody has." Those words were like water in the desert. Someone finally validated what I felt intuitively, that it was deeply wrong, that I didn't deserve to go through that it wasn't normal or acceptable. "We need to get you out of here," Miss Nancy continued, holding my hands tightly. "I know people in the big city who can help. There are shelters for girls like you." For the first time in years, I felt something different from fear and resignation. I felt hope. A small flame, fragile but real. "My mother," I began, thinking about what would happen to her if I ran away. "Your mother is an adult. She can take care of herself, or come along if she wants. But you are a child, Zelda. You need to be protected." That night, I couldn't sleep. The idea of escaping, of finding safety, of never again having to endure the hands of those men on my body, it was too powerful to allow sleep. But fate has a cruel way of interfering at the most important moments. The next morning, Miss Nancy was found collapsed in her yard. "A stroke," the neighbors said. She was rushed to the hospital in the neighboring town, but didn't survive. My only ally, my chance at salvation, left this world before being able to help me. The news hit me like a punch in the stomach. The small flame of hope that had been born was brutally extinguished. I was alone again, trapped in the same desperate situation with no way out in sight. 2 weeks later, my grandmother took me to a visit that would change everything. It was a man I had never seen before, at a remote farm. Something about him was different from the others, a colder, more calculating look. When I entered the room where he was waiting, I felt a chill that wasn't just from fear, but from pure terror. What happened in that room in the following hours was so brutal, so inhuman, that even now, 60 years later, I can't describe it in detail. He didn't just want to abuse me. He wanted to hurt me, humiliate me, completely destroy me. At a certain point, when I thought I had already endured the worst, he put his hands on my neck and began to squeeze. Hard, harder, and harder. I looked in his eyes and saw something I had never seen before, the desire to kill. "Nobody's going to miss you, you little slut," he whispered as he squeezed. "Your grandmother already got the money. What happens to you afterwards doesn't matter." It was at that moment, on the brink of death, that something inside me snapped. A survival instinct that I didn't even know still existed awakened with full force. My body, weak and hurt, found a final reserve of energy. With a sudden movement, I managed to break free, push him away. He, surprised by my unexpected resistance, fell backwards, hitting his head on the corner of the bedside table. I didn't stop to see if he was injured. I didn't stop to get my clothes. I ran, naked, bleeding, out of that room, out of that house, out of that life that wasn't a life. The dirt road stretched out in front of me, under a sky that was beginning to darken. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I couldn't go back. Never again. I ran down the dirt road like a wild animal fleeing from hunters, my body naked, cut, bleeding, but moved by a desperation that was stronger than any physical pain. I didn't look back even once. I was sure that man would come after me, that my grandmother would appear at any moment, that I would be dragged back to that hell. Night was falling fast in rural Kentucky. Soon the darkness would be complete, without city lights to illuminate the way. But the dark didn't scare me. I had lived in darkness for years. What terrified me was the idea of being found. After running for what seemed like an eternity, I spotted a small chapel by the roadside. one of those simple constructions that dot the American countryside, where the faithful stop to say prayers during journeys. It was empty, thank God. I took shelter there, curling up in a corner, trembling from cold, pain, and fear. It was in that chapel that I spent my first night of freedom. A frightening, uncertain freedom, but still freedom. I cried until I had no more tears, prayed with disconnected words, and eventually, too exhausted to remain conscious, I fell asleep. I woke up with the first rays of sun and the sound of a car approaching. I panicked. Was it him or my grandmother? I hid behind the small altar, covering my naked body with a cloth that served as a tablecloth for the offerings. I heard footsteps approaching, the chapel door opening. I held my breath. Good heavens, is someone there? It was a female voice, elderly. Even so, I didn't move, didn't answer. I had learned in the worst possible way not to trust adults. Child, I know you're there. I saw the blood trail at the entrance. I won't hurt you, I promise. Slowly, I peeked out from behind the altar. It was a black woman, with white hair tied in a bun, dressed simply but cleanly. She was carrying a grocery bag and a rosary wrapped around her hand. My God in heaven, she whispered when she saw me, completely naked, covered in bruises and cuts, with dried blood between my legs. Who did this to you, child? I couldn't answer. I just cried. A cry different from the night before. It was no longer the desperate cry of someone fleeing, but the relieved cry of someone who, after being lost for a long time, finds a human face that shows neither desire nor cruelty, just compassion. The lady, Miss Florence, as I discovered later, took the shawl that covered her shoulders and wrapped me in it. Without asking more questions, she took me to her car, an old station wagon that belonged to her son. She put me in the back seat, careful not to touch any of my wounds, and drove in silence to her house. Miss Florence lived alone in a small farm a few miles away. Her son, who was a truck driver, had bought that piece of land for her to spend her old age, and only appeared once a month during his breaks from the road. It was a simple place, but clean and organized, with a yard full of medicinal plants and fruit trees. She took me inside, filled a basin with warm water, and with a gentleness that I had never known, cleaned my wounds. She didn't ask questions about what had happened or how I had gotten into that situation. She just took care of me as if I were a bird fallen from the nest, fragile and in need of protection. After cleaning me up, she gave me an old dress that, although too big, was the first clean, unstained clothing I had worn in a long time. She prepared a chicken broth that reminded me how hungry I was. I ate slowly, with difficulty, my throat still sore from the hands that had tried to strangle me. It was only after feeding me and settling me on a clean mat near the wood stove that she finally asked, "Do you want to tell me what happened, child?" And for the second time in my life, I told. I told everything, from the beginning, from the first time my grandmother took me to do work. I told about the years of abuse, about the multiple men, about the threats, about hunger used as punishment. I told about my mother who didn't believe me, about the school I had abandoned, about the tuberculosis, about Miss Nancy who had tried to help me but died before she could. And finally, I told about the man who had tried to kill me the night before, about how I managed to escape, about how I ran naked down the road without knowing where to go. Miss Florence listened to everything without interrupting. When I finished, she was crying silently, tears running down her wrinkled face. "You're safe now," was all she said, holding my hands firmly. "As long as I live, no one will hurt you again." I spent 3 months hidden on that farm. I found out later that my grandmother and my mother searched for me in the region, that they went to the sheriff's office to report my disappearance, that they made up stories about me being a troubled girl who had run away from home taking money. The man I had pushed survived, apparently. He also looked for me, but for different reasons. He wanted revenge for the fall that left him with a deep cut on his head. But nobody thought to look on the isolated farm of an elderly lady. It was the perfect hiding place. Slowly, I began to recover. Not just from the physical wounds, which were many and serious, but also from the wounds of the soul, which were even deeper. Miss Florence never pressured me to talk about what had happened. She never demanded details. She was just there, a constant and comforting presence, teaching me small tasks around the farm, telling me stories of her own life, showing me that there was kindness in the world. She was a faith healer and herbalist, known in the region for her recipes of natural remedies. With her, I learned the power of plants, which healed wounds, which calmed the mind, which strengthened the body. It was ancestral knowledge passed down through generations that she now shared with me. "These plants are the wisdom of the earth," she would tell me as we harvested herbs in the yard. "They don't judge, they don't hurt. They just heal and strengthen those who know how to respect them." It was with her herbs and prayers that she treated not just my external wounds, but also the internal ones, the recurrent infections, the chronic pain, the damage caused by years of abuse and by the forced abortion that my grandmother had caused with a strong tea when I got pregnant at 12 years old. Yes, because there was a baby before my escape. A baby I never got to know, that was expelled from my still-forming body with bitter herbs that made me bleed for days, delirious with pain on the floor of our shack. My grandmother refused to call for help, saying it was fussiness, that women were made to endure pain. I almost died on that occasion, and a part of me really did die, an innocence that I never recovered. Miss Florence heard this story with tears in her eyes and then took me to a special little corner of the yard where she planted a rose bush. "This is the little angel's rose bush," she explained, "to honor the life that couldn't bloom, so that you know that that child was not guilty of anything, nor were you. The guilt was theirs, only theirs." It was the first time that someone acknowledged the baby I lost, the first time that I could openly cry for that loss, without shame or guilt. That rose bush became a place of healing for me. I watered it daily, talked to it, confessed my fears and hopes to it, and it grew, strong and resilient, just as I was beginning to grow. After 3 months, when my physical wounds had healed, and I no longer woke up screaming every night, Miss Florence called me for a serious conversation. "Zelda, you know you can't stay hidden here forever. You're 12 years old, you need to study, have a normal life. And I'm already old, I don't know how much longer I'll have on this earth." Panic immediately invaded me. Going back home was unthinkable. Going back to my grandmother, to those men? I would rather die. "I'm not going to send you back to that hell," she assured me, seeing my fear. "But I know a place in Cincinnati where they take care of girls who have suffered like you. A shelter run by nuns. There you can study, have a clean bed, food on the table, and most importantly, safety." Cincinnati seemed like another world. I had never left the countryside, never seen skyscrapers, never imagined a life beyond those dirt roads and simple little houses. The idea terrified and fascinated me at the same time. What if they find me there? What if my grandmother discovers where I am? "They won't find you. Cincinnati is too big, and at the shelter nobody will give you up. The nuns are strict but fair. They protect their girls like lionesses." So, on a morning in October 1966, I boarded the bus to Cincinnati, accompanied by Miss Florence. She had sold some chickens and a pig to buy the tickets and some new clothes for me. The first clothes that were really mine that I had ever owned. The trip lasted hours that seemed like days. The fear of being discovered, that my grandmother or one of those men would appear on the bus, didn't let me relax even for a minute. I held Miss Florence's hand so tightly that my fingers turned white. Cincinnati welcomed me with its heat, its strong smells, its incessant noise. A huge city, labyrinthine, so different from everything I knew that it seemed like another planet. The paved streets, the tall buildings, the cars everywhere, the hurried people who didn't even notice our presence. It was frightening and wonderful at the same time. The St. Mary's shelter was in an old mansion in a working-class neighborhood run by Franciscan nuns. When we arrived, we were greeted by Sister Conceição, a tall, thin woman with a stern face but kind eyes. Miss Florence explained my situation in general terms, a girl who had suffered serious abuse and needed protection. The nun didn't ask for details. She seemed to have seen cases like mine before. She just nodded and said that I would be welcome, that there would be a place for me among the other girls. Saying goodbye to Miss Florence was one of the hardest moments of my life. She had been my savior, my first experience of truly maternal love. She hugged me tight, whispering blessings and advice in my ear, and gave me a small cloth bag. "These are seeds from the little angel's rose bush," she explained. "When you have your own little corner, plant them. To remember that even from the most painful experiences, something beautiful can be born." I stayed at St. Mary's Shelter for 4 years. It was a period of difficult adaptation, of constant nightmares, of learning to trust again. The nuns were disciplinarians, maintained rigid routines, but were never cruel. There were daily prayers, classes, household chores, all at precise times. For someone who had lived in chaos and terror for so long, that structure was strangely comforting. The other girls had stories similar to mine. Some had been abused by stepfathers, others abandoned by mothers who couldn't support them. Others rescued from the streets where they prostituted themselves to survive. We were all survivors, each in our own way. I went back to studying, picking up from where I had left off when my grandmother took me out of school. At first, it was difficult to concentrate, to follow the lessons. My mind was still fragmented by trauma, full of black holes and memories that exploded at the most unexpected moments. But the nuns were patient, especially Sister Matilda, the English teacher who stayed with me after classes, helping me recover the lost time. "You have a gift with words, Zelda," she would tell me as she read my essays. "Through them, you can transform your pain into something greater than yourself." It was she who encouraged me to write a diary, to put on paper the memories that tormented me. At first, it was too painful. The words came out disjointed, stained with tears. But over time, I discovered that each memory I put on paper lost some of its power over me. It was like draining the poison from a wound so that it could finally heal. The years at the shelter weren't easy, but they were safe. For the first time since I was 7, I could sleep without fear of being woken up to do work. For the first time, I had regular meals, clean clothes, a place to call my own, even if it was just a bed in a dormitory shared with 15 other girls. At 16, I had to leave the shelter. It was the rule. When we completed that age, we needed to make room for younger, more vulnerable girls. Some went back to their families when that was possible and safe. Others went to work as domestic employees in houses that the nuns considered trustworthy. Some simply disappeared into the streets of Cincinnati, unable to adapt to a world they only knew through violence. For me, the nuns found a job in a small family boarding house near downtown. I would be responsible for cleaning the rooms and helping in the kitchen. In exchange, I would receive a small salary and could live in a small room at the back of the property. It was a new beginning, frightening, uncertain, but still a new beginning. I was 16 years old, healthy, although tuberculosis had left scars on my lungs that I carry to this day. And for the first time, a future ahead of me that I myself could shape. Mrs. Martha, the owner of the boarding house, was a middle-aged woman, widow of a businessman who had left that small business as support for her and the 2 sons. She was demanding with the work, but fair. And most importantly, she respected my boundaries, never asked about my past, never tried to touch me or approach me in ways that made me uncomfortable. It was at the boarding house that I met Mr. Augustus, a retired teacher who rented one of the rooms permanently. He was a man in his 60s, white hair, thick glasses, always with a book in hand. He noticed how I looked curiously at his small personal library while tidying up the room. "Do you like to read, girl?" he asked one day, catching me looking at the spines of the books. "Yes, sir. I learned at the shelter, with the nuns." He smiled, a gentle smile that contained no ulterior motive, something that took me a long time to recognize after years of associating male smiles with imminent danger. "You can borrow whatever you want." Books were made to circulate, not to gather dust on shelves. Thus began an unlikely friendship between a traumatized 16-year-old girl and a retired 60-year-old teacher. He loaned me books, discussed the stories with me, explained words and concepts that I didn't understand. Through these books, I discovered worlds that I had never imagined, lives so different from mine that they seemed like fantasies. Mr. Augustus never tried anything inappropriate, never crossed the boundaries of a respectful friendship. He was the first man I was able to trust after everything I had been through. He became a kind of father or grandfather that I never had, someone who cared about my growth, about my future, without expecting anything in return. It was he who encouraged me to formally finish my studies. With his help, I enrolled in a night GED program. I worked at the boarding house during the day and studied at night. It was exhausting, but each book I read, each knowledge I acquired, took me a little further away from that terrified girl who had fled naked down a dirt road years before. The past, however, never completely abandons us. Even in moments of greatest peace, it finds ways to remind us of its existence. For me, this reminder came when I turned 18 in the form of a letter delivered to the boarding house. It was from Miss Florence, my savior, the woman who had found me in the chapel and sheltered me on her farm. We hadn't kept in touch since my going to the shelter. It was safer that way, to prevent my grandmother from being able to track me down. The letter was brief, written in shaky handwriting. She was sick, knew she didn't have much time, and wanted to see me one last time. It included the address of the farm and a bus ticket back to the countryside. My first instinct was fear. Going back to that region meant the risk of encountering my grandmother or one of those men. It meant revisiting places I had fought to forget. But how could I deny the last request of the woman who had saved my life? After much reflection, many sleepless nights, I decided to go. I asked for a few days off from the boarding house and boarded the bus with my heart racing. With each mile that brought us closer to the countryside, my anxiety increased. It reached a point where I thought about asking the driver to stop, to run back to the safety of Cincinnati. But I continued, for Miss Florence, and perhaps, although I didn't admit it to myself, for some kind of closure that my soul still needed. The bus left me in the small town closest to the farm. I would have to walk the rest of the way. It was strange to be back on those red dirt roads, under that open sky of the countryside, among those smells of childhood, corn, dust, wood stove smoke. I walked slowly, alert to every movement, every sound. With each person who passed, I shrank my shoulders, lowered my head, tried to make myself invisible, old habits that instinctively resurfaced. When I finally spotted the farm, my heart tightened. It seemed smaller, more worn by time. Miss Florence's son, Robert, was in the yard fixing a fence. He didn't recognize me immediately. The frightened 12-year-old girl had become an 18-year-old young woman, taller, stronger, with a different look. "Zelda?" he asked, uncertain, when I approached. "My God, how you've grown!" He took me inside. Miss Florence was in bed, visibly weak, consumed by a cancer that had spread too quickly for remedies, natural or conventional, to take effect. But her eyes still had that same kindness that had saved me years before. "My child," she whispered when she saw me, extending her trembling hand. "You came back." I spent 3 days by her side. 3 days taking care of her as she had taken care of me, preparing the teas that she herself had taught me to make, telling stories of my life in Cincinnati, listening to her last advice and blessings. On the morning of the 4th day, she departed. Silently, without suffering, like someone who just decides it's time to continue the journey. I held her hand until the end, feeling life leave that body that had harbored so much wisdom and kindness. The funeral was simple, as she would have wished. Just me, Robert, and a few close neighbors. When it was all over, he called me for a conversation. "My mother left something for you," he said, handing me an envelope. She asked that I only deliver it after she was gone. Inside the envelope was a deed. Miss Florence had left the farm to me. That piece of land where I had found safety for the first time, where my healing had begun, would be mine. "But what about you?" I asked Robert, confused. "You're her son. You should have everything." He smiled, a smile that reminded me of his mother's. "I have my life on the road, my house in the city. This place always meant more to you than to me." My mother knew that. I returned to Cincinnati to organize my life, finish my studies, say goodbye to Mrs. Martha and Mr. Augustus. 3 months later, I was back at the farm. My farm, now. It was risky, I knew. My grandmother still lived in the region, perhaps some of those men too. But something inside me had changed. I was no longer the terrified girl who ran to hide. I was a woman who had survived the worst and was ready to face her demons. The first one I encountered was from the past. At the town market buying supplies for the farm, I came face to face with my mother. 6 years had passed since my escape. She looked much older, bent, with deep circles under her eyes and already graying hair despite being only 40 years old. We stared at each other for a long moment. I saw the recognition in her eyes, followed by shock, disbelief, and then shame. Deep, painful shame. "Zelda?" she whispered, as if seeing a ghost. "Is it you? Is it you, Zelda?" My mother's voice was a trembling whisper in the middle of that market, as if she were seeing a ghost. For a moment, I was paralyzed. So many emotions crossed through me at once: anger, fear, sadness, and something I didn't expect to feel: pity. My mother looked like an aged and worn-out version of the woman I remembered. Deep wrinkles marked her face, prematurely gray hair, hands calloused from so much work. Her eyes, however, were what impacted me the most. Empty eyes, defeated, of someone carrying a weight too great. "Yes, it's me," I answered, surprisingly calm. She took a hesitant step toward me, hands extended as if wanting to touch something to confirm it was real. Instinctively, I backed away. 6 years had not been enough to erase the reflex of fear. "We thought you had died," she said, her voice choked. After you ran away, that man, he said he had—" She left the sentence hanging, unable to complete it. She didn't need to. I understood what had happened. The man who tried to kill me must have said he succeeded, that my body was somewhere in the woods. It was easier for him than admitting that a 12-year-old girl had escaped from his hands. "I'm alive," I confirmed, feeling a strange strength grow inside me. I survived. I didn't say how or where. Some things didn't need to be shared, at least not there, in the middle of a market full of curious eyes and attentive ears. "Your grandmother," she began, but I interrupted her. "I don't want to know about her." "Never again." Something in my tone must have made it clear that the subject was closed. My mother just nodded, eyes lowered, immersed in that shame I had seen when we recognized each other. Can I see you again?" she asked, her voice almost inaudible. "I have so much to tell you, to try to explain." Explain. As if there could be any possible explanation for allowing your own daughter to be sold, abused, destroyed. As if any word could justify years of voluntary blindness. But there was something about her. Perhaps the way her shoulders curved under the weight of guilt, or how her hands trembled slightly, that prevented me from refusing completely. "I'm living at Miss Florence's farm," I said finally. "If you want to find me, you know where it is." With that, I picked up my purchases and left the market, feeling her gaze on my back. I didn't look back even once. I had already learned that looking back only brings pain. She appeared 3 days later. Alone, thank God. The idea of seeing my grandmother again gave me chills. She was nervous, I could tell by the hesitant steps, by the way she twisted a worn handkerchief between her fingers. I prepared coffee, a luxury I could now afford, growing my own beans on the farm. We sat on the porch, the same place where Miss Florence had taught me about herbs and medicinal plants, where my healing had begun. For a few minutes, we sat in silence, only the sound of birds and wind in the leaves filling the space between us. Then she began to speak, and what I heard left me both furious and devastated. My grandmother Josephine had done to my mother exactly what she did to me. She had begun selling her at 8 years old to the same types of men for the same type of money. For years, my mother suffered the same abuses, the same threats, the same terror that I would come to know. When she got pregnant with me, at 14 years old, the result of one of these encounters arranged by my grandmother, she didn't have the option to abort. My grandmother saw in me a future source of income, a continuation of the perverse cycle. She kept me alive for this. She always said it was the destiny of the women in our family, my mother explained, silent tears running down her marked face, that her mother had done the same to her, and her mother's mother before that. A cycle that came from generations. When I was born, my mother tried to protect me as she could. She found work outside the home, to stay as much time as possible away from the influence of her own mother. But she needed to work more and more to support us, inevitably leaving me under the care of my grandmother. "I suspected," she admitted, her voice broken by shame. "I saw the signs, the bruises, the way you changed, how your eyes lost their sparkle. But I didn't want to believe it. I couldn't believe that my own mother was doing to you what she did to me. And when I tried to tell you? I asked, the old pain resurfacing. When I finally found the courage and you hit me, called me a liar. She covered her face with her hands, openly sobbing now. Because at that moment, admitting the truth would be admitting my own failure. That I couldn't protect you. That I allowed the cycle to continue. It was easier to believe the lie. Easier to pretend that nothing was happening. I don't know if I forgave her that day. Forgiveness isn't something simple, not after so much suffering. But I understood something important. My mother was also a victim. A victim who became an accomplice through weakness, through fear, through her own unresolved pain. This didn't erase her responsibility, but it put her actions and inactions in a different light. And Grandma Jo? I asked, fearing the answer. Is she still? My mother shook her head. Died 2 years ago. Cirrhosis. The whiskey finally took its toll. I felt an enormous relief, followed by a confusion of emotions difficult to name. It wasn't exactly joy at someone's death, not even someone who had caused me so much harm. It was more like liberation, the certainty that that woman could never hurt another child again. That with her, perhaps, that terrible cycle had finally found its end. After that day, my mother and I developed a cautious relationship. It wasn't the unconditional love between mother and daughter that some people know. It was something more complex, built on the ruins of a painful past, fed by a mutual understanding of suffering and by the shared determination to break that family pattern. She never came to live with me on the farm, preferring to maintain a certain distance, perhaps out of shame, perhaps out of respect for my space and my healing. But she visited regularly, helped with planting and harvesting, learned about the medicinal herbs that I now cultivated following Miss Florence's teachings. It was during one of these visits, about a year after our reunion, that she told me about the men. Those who had abused me, whom my grandmother had brought to our house, who had paid to destroy my childhood. Most of them are already dead, she said, while we separated coriander seeds on the porch. Old age, disease, accidents. Colonel Zachary had a stroke that left him confined to a bed, unable to speak or move. They say he suffers day and night. I didn't feel joy at this news, nor satisfied revenge. What I felt was a strange kind of peace, as if the universe, in its own way and in its own time, was balancing the accounts. And that last one? I asked, referring to the man who had tried to kill me, from whose hands I had escaped that desperate night. The one who said he had killed me. A sad smile passed over my mother's face, disappeared shortly after. They say he went away to Ohio. Others say he got involved with dangerous people and ended up at the bottom of some river. Nobody knows for sure. I never knew what happened to him either, and I decided that it didn't matter. He no longer had power over me, over my dreams, over my future. He was just a shadow from the past, increasingly distant as I built my new life. And it was a surprisingly good life, considering how it began. Miss Florence's farm prospered in my hands. I learned to work the land, to cultivate not just to survive, but to heal. The medicinal herbs that she had taught me to recognize and use became the basis of my livelihood. In the beginning, people from the region came seeking simple remedies, teas for headaches, ointments for injuries, syrups for coughs. Over time, my reputation grew. Travelers came from far away to consult the herb lady, as I came to be known. It wasn't just knowledge of plants that attracted people. It was something deeper, more difficult to explain. Perhaps it was because I, having known the depths of human suffering, could recognize the pain in others' eyes. I knew how to listen without judging, to advise without imposing, to offer comfort without false promises. Many of the people who sought me out were women and girls who were victims of abuse similar to what I suffered. They came seeking remedies for injured bodies, but also for broken souls. And I discovered that, by helping them heal, I also healed myself. Each story heard, each piece of advice given, each hand held in moments of despair reminded me that my suffering had not been in vain, that I could transform it into something greater, something that helped break the cycle for others. It was in 1978, at 25 years old, that I met Joseph. He was a young agronomist who worked on a rural extension project, teaching sustainable agricultural techniques to small producers in the region. He came to my farm to talk about new planting methods, but ended up staying to learn about my medicinal herbs. Joseph was different from any man I had ever known, quiet, respectful, with a genuine curiosity about my work and my knowledge. He never tried to impress or dominate me, never invaded my personal space, never assumed he was entitled to anything beyond what I freely offered. Our friendship grew slowly, over months of periodic visits, conversations about plants and crops, exchanges of knowledge and experiences. I only realized I was falling in love when I caught myself anxiously waiting for his visits, preparing special cakes on days I knew he would come, dreaming of his calm smile on lonely nights. The fear, however, was enormous. After everything I had been through, the idea of physical intimacy terrified me. The memories of abuse were still there, buried deeper, but ready to resurface at the slightest trigger. How to explain this to a man? How to make him understand that my retreat wasn't rejection, but trauma? It was one of the women I helped heal who gave me the advice that would change everything. "Tell him," said Maria, a middle-aged woman who had survived a violent marriage. "If he's the right man, he'll understand. If he doesn't understand, he's not the man for you." Gathering all the courage I had, on an afternoon of fine rain that left the air perfumed with the smell of wet earth, I told Joseph parts of my story. Not all the sordid details. Some horrors are too heavy to share, but enough for him to understand why I trembled when he got too close, why I became tense when we were alone, why I would need time and infinite patience if he wanted to build something with me. He listened in silence, eyes fixed on mine, unshed tears occasionally gleaming. When I finished, I expected to see pity, perhaps disgust, or that morbid curiosity that many people have in the face of others' suffering. What I saw was respect. Deep, sincere respect. "Thank you for trusting me with your story," he said simply. "It must have taken a lot of courage. I want you to know that I will never, ever do anything that causes you fear or discomfort. We can go at your pace always. And if that pace is never going beyond friendship, that's fine too." We married a year later, in a simple ceremony on the farm itself. Just a few close friends, my mother and Miss Florence's son, who came especially for the occasion. I planted flowers around the little angel's rose bush, which was now large and leafy, so that it would also participate somehow in that moment of joy. Our life together had its challenges, of course. There were nights when I woke up screaming, trapped in nightmares where rough hands still hurt me. Moments when an unexpected touch made me stiffen with fear. Situations where intimacy became impossible due to sudden flashbacks. But Joseph never complained, never pressured, never made me feel broken or insufficient. With infinite patience, he helped me rediscover my own body, not as a source of pain and shame, but of pleasure and connection. A year after the wedding, I discovered I was pregnant. The news brought a complex mixture of joy and terror. My only previous experience with pregnancy had been that one, at 12 years old, brutally ended with a forced abortion that almost killed me. The idea of carrying a child inside me again awakened memories that I preferred to keep buried. "I'm afraid," I confessed to Joseph one night, lying in our simple wooden bed that he himself had built. "What if I can't love this child? What if seeing it makes me remember everything I went through?" He held my hand between his, those calloused hands from work on the land that had never, not once, caused me pain. "Then we'll face it together," he promised. One day at a time. Nina was born on a hot March dawn in 1980, after a difficult labor that lasted almost 20 hours. When the midwife placed her in my arms, small and red, crying strongly, something extraordinary happened. All the fear, all the apprehension, all the anticipated terror simply disappeared. In their place, a love so immense, so overwhelming, that it barely fit in my chest. Looking at that perfect little face, I made a silent promise. This child would never know the kind of pain I knew, would never feel fear inside her own home, would never doubt the unconditional love of her parents, and above all, would never, ever be forced to grow up before her time. Nina was the first of 3 children. Then came Matthew and Claire, each bringing more light and love to our family. I raised them with a combination of fierce protection and careful freedom. I wanted them to be strong, independent, capable of recognizing danger, but without the crushing weight of distrust that I carried. I told my story to them when they were grown enough to understand. Not all the horrible details, but enough for them to know where they came from, what cycles we had broken, what choices we had made to ensure that the past didn't determine the future. "Grandma," Nina said to me once, already an adult, with children of her own, "how did you do it? How did you survive all that and still become someone so full of love?" The question caught me by surprise. I had never thought of it in those terms. Surviving had been instinct. Loving had been choice. Day after day, decision after decision, choosing not to let hate and resentment poison what I had managed to build. "I had help," I finally answered. "Miss Florence, the nuns at the shelter, your father, people who showed me that there was kindness in the world, even after I had known the worst of it. And I had you, my children, who gave me a reason to break the cycle, to be better than those who came before me." Today, at 72 years old, looking back at the long road I've traveled since that 7-year-old girl being taken for the first time to do work, I feel a kind of peace that I never thought possible. It's not a perfect peace. The scars are still there. Some nights are still long. Some triggers can still momentarily transport me back to those dark rooms. But it's a real peace, built not in denial of suffering, but in its transformation. A peace that comes from knowing that, despite everything they tried to take from me, innocence, dignity, even life itself, they couldn't take my capacity to love, to heal, to grow. The girl who ran naked down a dirt road, bleeding and terrified, found not just refuge, but purpose. The cycle of generations of abuse that seemed destined to continue was broken by my hands, by my choices, by my refusal to accept that pain was all that life had to offer. And if there's one lesson I'd like to leave for those who hear my story, it's this: no matter how deep the darkness, there is always a path to the light. No matter how many times they try to break you, there is always the possibility of rebuilding yourself, stronger, wiser, more complete. Healing doesn't erase the scars, but transforms them into marks of a battle won, of a life reclaimed. Time has a curious way of passing. When we look back, decades seem to compress into moments, like pages of a book quickly leafed through by the wind. In these moments of reflection, I clearly see how each choice, each small victory over fear, brought me to where I am now, to this porch where I now rock in the chair that Joseph built for me almost 40 years ago. Rebuilding a life after being so deeply broken is not a linear process. There is no single moment of complete healing, no magical day when we wake up and all the trauma has disappeared. It's more like learning to live with a part of yourself that has been altered forever, but without allowing that part to define who you are or who you can become. When Nina turned 7, the same age I was when my grandmother began selling me, I went through a period of anxiety so intense that I could barely sleep. I would stay awake, watching my daughter sleep, terrified by the idea that something horrible might happen to her, that I might fail to protect her just as my mother failed me. Joseph noticed, of course. He always had a special sensitivity for moments when the past came back to haunt me. "You are not your grandmother," he would gently remind me, "nor your mother. You are Zelda, the strongest and most loving woman I know. Nina is safe with us." It was true, but fear isn't rational. I only began to calm down when Nina passed 12, the age at which I escaped. Healthy, happy, protected, loved. When she turned 15 without ever having known the kind of horror that marked my childhood, I could finally breathe a little easier. We had broken the cycle. The curse of generations had not reached my daughter. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, our little farm transformed. With Joseph's knowledge of sustainable agriculture and my own knowledge of medicinal plants, we created a place that wasn't just our home, but a center of healing and learning for the community. I began to receive women, more and more of them, who came seeking not just remedies for the body, but for the soul. Women beaten by their husbands, girls abused by stepfathers or uncles, elderly women abandoned by family. They came first for the teas and ointments, then returned for the conversations, for the welcome, for the possibility of being heard without judgment. "How did you manage to overcome it, Mrs. Zelda?" was the question I heard most. How did you find the strength to move forward? I never had easy answers. Each person is unique. Each trauma leaves different marks. What worked for me might not work for others. But there was something I always shared. The idea that we are stronger than we imagine, that within us exists a capacity for regeneration that goes beyond what seems possible in moments of greatest despair. In 1988, we formalized our work by creating the Wildflowers Association. With the help of some friends, including Mr. Augustus, the retired teacher who had encouraged me to study years before, we secured a small grant to build some basic facilities: a larger room for consultations, a shed for processing herbs, a space for meetings and workshops. The goal was simple: to offer women in the region not just emergency help, but tools to rebuild their own lives. We taught everything from planting techniques and preparation of natural remedies to basic notions of rights, literacy for those who couldn't read, and mainly, ways to become financially independent. Financial independence is the first step to freedom, I always said. When you can support yourself, you can choose to stay or leave. It was work that required infinite patience. Many women returned to abusive relationships several times before they could finally leave for good. Some never managed to. But each small victory, a woman who finally reported her abuser, a young girl who went back to school, an elderly woman who regained her dignity, was celebrated as a greater triumph. Our family grew along with the work. Nina, Matthew, and Claire were raised among these brave women, learning early about compassion, justice, and the importance of extending a hand to those in need. Initially, Joseph and I tried to protect them from the most difficult stories, from the darkest details of what happened in so many homes. But children perceive more than we imagine. "Why does that lady have a black eye, Mom?" Matthew asked once, at 8 years old, after seeing a young woman who had just arrived at the farm, fleeing from her violent husband. We then decided that it was better to educate them with the truth, adapted to the age of each one, than to let them create fantasies that might be even more frightening. We explained in simple words that some people hurt others, that some families were not safe places, and that our work was to help those who needed refuge and healing. "Like you needed once?" asked Claire, my youngest, with that sharp perception she always had. It was the first time I mentioned parts of my story to my children. I didn't go into details. They were too young, but I said that yes, I too had needed help when I was young. And that's why I understood the importance of extending a hand to others. As they grew, I shared more. When Nina had her first period at 11 years old, I told her how my own entry into puberty had been marked by an increase in the services my grandmother forced me to do, how my developing body attracted a different kind of attention, more dangerous. Not to frighten her, but so she would understand the importance of speaking openly, of never keeping secrets that hurt, of trusting that her parents would always believe her. When Matthew, at 14, began to show interest in a schoolmate, we talked about consent, about how desire never justifies imposing oneself on another person, about how a true man is not one who dominates, but one who respects. Claire, always the most sensitive of the three, was the one who most identified with our work. From a young age, she accompanied me in herb harvests, learned the names and properties of each plant, attentively observed how I prepared the remedies. At 16, she was already conducting some workshops on her own, teaching older women how to make ointments and syrups. "I want to be like you when I grow up," she told me one day, while we worked together processing lemon balm. "I want to help people heal." The pride I felt at that moment is indescribable. It wasn't just a mother's pride seeing her daughter find her path, but the deep sensation that something had been redeemed, that from the arid soil of suffering had sprouted not just survival, but purpose that extended beyond myself. The 1990s brought significant changes to our region and our work. Information began to circulate more quickly, even in rural areas. Laws protecting women, although insufficient, were discussed. Girls stayed in school longer, dreamed of universities, of careers beyond marriage and motherhood. Our association grew, gained recognition. We began to receive visits from groups from other cities, from university students interested in traditional medicine, from researchers documenting folk knowledge. In 1997, I was invited to speak at a conference in Cincinnati about traditional healing practices. Me, who had barely completed basic education, speaking before doctors, anthropologists, scientists. The fear was immense. Who was I to speak to those people full of diplomas and formal knowledge? What did I have to offer beyond stories and personal experiences? Exactly that, said Joseph, always my biggest supporter. Your stories and experiences are your greatest treasure. They are real, they are lived, they are true. They may have studied from books, but you learned in your own skin. That lecture was a watershed. I spoke about the plants I used, of course, about preparation methods, about the results I saw. But I spoke mainly about healing as a holistic process. That it's no use treating the body if the soul remains sick. That many of the ailments I treated had roots not in bacteria or viruses, but in various forms of violence, in broken hearts, in spirits crushed by years of abuse. I didn't reveal my personal story on that occasion. I wasn't yet ready to expose my past so publicly. But I spoke as someone who knows the territory of suffering from the inside, not just as a distant observer. And that made all the difference. After that lecture, our work gained even more visibility. We received support from national and international NGOs, managed to expand our facilities, offer more services. In 2001, we inaugurated the House of Flowers, a temporary shelter for women in extreme violence situations who needed a safe place to stay while rebuilding their lives. It was a simple but significant ceremony. Nina, already with a degree in psychology, took over coordination of the shelter. Matthew, who had followed in his father's footsteps in agronomy, took care of the productive part of the farm, developing sustainable crops that helped economically maintain our increasingly larger structure. Claire, who chose to study nursing, divided her time between the regional hospital and our care center. My mother was present at the inauguration. Our relationship had improved over the years, although it never became completely free of the shadows of the past. She never remarried, dedicating herself to volunteer work with orphaned children. A form of redemption, perhaps, for not having been able to protect me. "You did it, daughter," she said, looking at the simple plaque that identified the House of Flowers. "You transformed pain into something beautiful." It was true. That place represented everything I didn't have: safety, shelter, the possibility of starting over without fear. Each woman who passed through our doors had the chance that was denied to me for so many years. The chance to write her own story, free from the hands that tried to control her. In 2010, at 57 years old, I did something I never imagined I would do. I wrote a book. It wasn't a technical book about medicinal plants, although that knowledge was present in the pages. It was my story, told for the first time in a complete way, without censorship or omissions. Flowers Among Thorns was born from hundreds of sleepless nights, from tears shed over a simple notebook, from deep conversations with Joseph and my children who encouraged me at every step. It wasn't easy to relive certain moments, to put into words experiences that for so long remained only as sensations of terror in my body. But it was liberating. The book, initially published by a small regional publisher, exceeded all expectations. It was reprinted several times, reached other regions of the country, eventually was translated into Spanish and distributed in other countries of the Americas. I received hundreds of letters and later emails from women who identified with parts of my journey, who found hope in the possibility of reconstruction that my story represented. "Your story saved my life," wrote a young woman from Indiana. "I was about to give up when I read your book and realized that if you managed to survive what you went through, I can too." It was difficult to assimilate the impact that my words had. I, who for so long was silenced, threatened not to tell what I was living, now saw my voice reach places I never imagined, touch lives I would never know personally. With the royalties from the book, we expanded our work even more. We created a scholarship program for young survivors of violence, a community library specializing in women's rights, professional training workshops in various areas. Our small farm transformed into a true center of social transformation, receiving people from all over the country. Joseph was by my side at each step of this journey, my companion, my safe harbor. Even when the work required travel, lectures, meetings, he never complained, never made me feel divided between my family responsibilities and my greater mission. "Your purpose is part of who you are," he would say, "and I fell in love with who you are, not with who I thought I could shape." Life, however, always reminds us of its impermanent nature. In 2018, Joseph was diagnosed with aggressive pancreatic cancer. In just 6 months, the strong man who had been my support for more than 4 decades withered before my eyes, consumed by the disease that not even the best treatments could stop. His departure was peaceful, at home, surrounded by me, our children, and grandchildren. "I have no regrets," were his last words to me. "We lived a good life, Zelda, a life of love and purpose." The grief was deep, but different from any pain I had ever experienced. It wasn't the corrosive despair of trauma, but a luminous sadness woven with threads of gratitude for everything we had shared. I cried not because our story had ended tragically, but because it had been too beautiful not to leave longing. The following years were of adjustments, of discovering how to continue without the one who had been my life partner for so long. Our children feared that I would isolate myself, that I would lose interest in the work that had been our shared passion. But I discovered that Joseph's legacy continued alive not only in the features of our children and grandchildren, but in the very structure of what we had built together. At 65, I decided it was time to pass the baton. Nina, Matthew, and Claire were already managing a large part of the association's activities. A new generation of women, many of them daughters and even granddaughters of the first ones we helped, was assuming leadership positions, bringing fresh ideas, innovative approaches. I didn't completely step away, of course. I continued guiding, advising, sharing knowledge accumulated over decades of work. But I allowed myself to slow down, dedicate more time to simple things like tending my garden, making cookies with my grandchildren, watching the sunset from my porch with a cup of lemon balm tea in my hands. In 2021, at 68 years old, I received a call that left me speechless. It was from the Department of Human Rights, informing me that I had been nominated to receive the Human Rights Medal, one of the highest decorations in the country in the field. The ceremony in Washington, D.C. was surreal. Me, a girl from rural Kentucky who at 7 years old was sold by her own grandmother, now being applauded by authorities, activists, personalities. When they called my name and read the citation, "For her extraordinary contribution in the fight against child sexual violence and in creating innovative methodologies for welcoming and recovering survivors," I had to hold back tears. In the acceptance speech, I spoke about that 7-year-old girl, about how she ran naked down a dirt road to escape the horror, about how she found outstretched hands that helped her rebuild. I spoke about how each of us can be that outstretched hand for someone in despair, how small acts of kindness can literally save lives. No child should go through what I went through, I concluded. But as long as this reality still exists, we need to ensure that there is also hope on the other side. That for every abuser, there are 10 protectors. That for every abuse, there are 100 acts of healing. That for every trauma, there are 1,000 possibilities of reconstruction. Today, at 72 years old, looking back, I see not just the pain and horror that marked my childhood, but also the long and extraordinary journey of reconstruction that came afterward. I see the hundreds of women and children who passed through the House of Flowers, many of them now building their own stories of overcoming. I see my children and grandchildren growing without the weight of the cycle of violence that marked generations of my family before them. I see the little angel's rosebush, now huge, surrounded by other flowers planted by different hands over the years, a literal and symbolic garden of healing. And I realize that, in some mysterious and profound way, nothing was in vain. That each tear shed, each wound inflicted, each night of terror transformed, through conscious choices and constant work, into tools to heal not just myself, but countless others. This is the alchemy of life, our capacity to transform the lead of suffering into the gold of wisdom and compassion. It's not magic, it's hard work. It doesn't happen overnight, but over decades of small daily choices not to give in to bitterness, to hatred, to despair. My dear friends who are listening to me now, If this story touched your heart in some way, I ask that you leave your, subscribe to the Grandparents' Tales channel, and share with someone who might need to hear that reconstruction is possible, that the end of a nightmare can be the beginning of a meaningful life. And remember that no one should face their demons alone. No one should carry the weight of trauma without a friendly hand to share the burden. If you're going through something difficult now, know that you're not alone. There is always a path to healing, always a possibility of reconstruction, always a new morning waiting after the darkest night. This grandma who speaks to you has seen the worst and the best of humanity, and chooses to believe in the best every day. You too can make that choice. Thank you for listening to me until here. May God protect the path of each one of you, and may you never lack the courage to transform pain into purpose, trauma into wisdom, and scars into maps to guide others to freedom.